Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, boxing fans worldwide. This is a new series inspired by the build-up of what's coming, and I want to showcase with my voice a number of boxers that I believe stand out. These are guys that are arguably, the lifeblood of the sport, meaning that without guys of their spirit, of their style, of their delivery, of their energy, we don't have a sport of boxing. I'm sure you've heard it time and again about MMA's killing boxing and boxing's dying, and you got YouTubers out there that are headlining and it's the decline of boxing, and then Floyd goes the distance with Logan Paul and all of this chatter about boxing, and really we're missing the key point here. The point isn't necessarily what is happening as far as certain types of fights. What's happening is what's been missing that we don't have in large variety like we used to have in the glory days of the sport. And that's what I want to spotlight and showcase with my voice a number of fighters that I believe still maintain the spirit of what boxing used to be like. And we should celebrate these boxers because a lot of them get flack because they're not the Sugar Ray Leonards or the Thomas Hearnses of the world. No, they're not trying to be. They're making their own legacy. They're making their own past. They're making their own pathway forward. And they have done an outstanding job, in my opinion, of keeping the life of boxing alive because it has taken a dip. It has suffered. Even now, some of our main event fights have not lived up to the hype and they have let us down. And people don't understand why it's letting you down. It's not letting you down because of anything. This notion that the Paul brothers are ruining boxing and the exhibitions are ruining boxing and all of this. Let me educate you a little bit. And I want to focus back on Showtime Shawn Porter, who is the highlight of this episode. But just to give you a little bit of history, and then I'll do a separate entry that digs a little deeper. But just to be clear here, we have had strong fight of the year candidates. We have had them. Okay, you've got Shawn Porter and Errol Spence. You had Porter and Berto and Ortiz. And so I can name so many that have been done and they have been done right and they have excited you as a fan and they've got you on the edge of your seat. So I don't want to hear that those fights don't happen, but you got to recognize a pattern, or as Tim Bradley likes to pronounce it, a pattern of who is actually giving you the fights you want to see, who is actually trying to entertain you as a fan, who is trying to give you your money's worth. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to start off with Showtime Shawn Porter because on recent memory, I can't think of another fighter who has been consistent in trying to entertain the fans every time he goes in the ring. Now, he has naysayers. He has people that criticize his style of boxing, which I would argue has evolved. If you've been paying attention to him as a fighter, he has evolved his style and he adapts to the person that's in front of him. He is not just a slugger. He is not just a brawler. He can box as well, as we saw against Yordenis Ugas. I talked about Ugas on a previous episode. So this notion that all he does is go in as a linebacker is faulty. Is that his primary strategy? It depends on the fighter that's across from him, but largely if he sees that there's an opportunity, he's going to go forward. We should be celebrating this, not criticizing it, because there are too many fighters who are too willing to go backwards, many fighters who are happy that they took a loss and too willing to say, well, I got beat, whatever. I still remember going back, Lomachenko versus Nick Walters, and Nick Walters basically told the ref, no, and then ran across the ring and hugs this guy for making him quit. This is what we don't want out of boxing, and this is what we don't want to see from the sport, because when we see that kind of stuff, it's supposed to be a gladiator sport. I actually had a conversation the other day about the fact it is the hurt business. Your job is to get your hand raised, but it's the hurt business because somebody's got to hurt you to make you vulnerable, to get you out of there, to make the ref stop the fight, or to convince the judges that you were the better man that night. It's the hurt business. It's harder to say that it's the hurt business when you're watching somebody like a Frank Sanchez who is afraid, I won't say afraid because he really wasn't, who is hesitant to engage because he's a counter-style fighter. Those kind of fights stink out the joint against Ajagba. He's stinking out the joint, and it makes people not want to watch the sport. I don't care what you say about the dude. Jake Paul actually tries to give the fans something exciting. Is he the best boxer? No. But he tries to excite the fans. He tries to entertain you. And Floyd Mayweather Jr. said it on multiple occasions that entertainment is really the key to it all. It wasn't necessarily skill, although that played a factor. Is a guy able to entertain you as a fighter? With Shawn, I've watched his fights and I've watched his destruction of Paulie Malignaggi. I watched his blowout -1 round of Adrian Broner. I watched his war with Andre Berto. I watched his war with Keith One-Time Thurman. I watched his pseudo war with Danny Swift Garcia. I watched his war with Errol Spence. I watched his absolute domination of a really tough Sebastian Formella. I've watched this guy numerous times go into that ring and do everything he can to get his hand raised and try to entertain you and make sure you got your money's worth by the end of it. I can't think of any other fighter, which is why he's number one, who has actively worked to try to entertain me. That's critical. It's not even just what he does in the ring. He is a well-spoken, very educated young man. I say young man because he's young compared to me, believe it or not, but he's a very educated, very well-spoken young man. He's very polite and respectful, but when he needs to turn it up, he knows how to turn it up, and he knows when we're in that ring, it's time to go to war, and I need to give these people a show because I want them not only to come back, but to tell their friends about me and have their friends dial in and watch me, because that's how you build stars. Shawn Porter is a star. I understand NSB and some other places don't see him as a star, but the fact is he is a star because of what he puts in that ring every time he goes out. The second factor, which is even more important than his effort, is his level of opposition. He has actively sought out smoke. He has gone after dangerous opponents, guys that in other levels on white paper, you would think that, hey, this guy should have an advantage over him and should wash him, and then he makes it close. Nobody has managed to make Shawn Porter look like a completely lesser fighter, ever. I don't care what you say. Nobody has managed to do it. It's either he's winning the fight or it's razor close. How can a guy not be at the top, at the upper echelon, when it's a tough out every time you're in the ring with this guy? The only counter argument people have against Shawn Porter is a fight style, which, as I said before, it is not the same fight style every fight, but your mind is lying to you. Your mind's playing tricks on you, aka Ghetto Boys. That's what's happening. You are not seeing him adapt to the people that's in front of him, where sometimes he will go forward aggressive when he feels there's a reason to, as he did with Errol Spence. Sometimes he will stay back in box because it's expected he would go forward and he's trying to throw his opponent off, as we saw with Yordenis Ugas. Sometimes he's just going to go and slug it out, as we saw with Andre Berto. Sometimes he is going to try to mix it up a little bit, as we saw with Keith Thurman. This guy is versatile. This guy has different strategies, and he's a very crafty fighter. Not only that, he's a tough fighter. People will say, well, he got dropped by Adrian Broner. I want to tell you something. Shawn Porter was winning that fight so darn decisively that, and by his own admission, basically in the round 11, he took his eye off the prize and got caught. It happens to the best of fighters. By the way, it happened to Terence Crawford against Kavaliauskas. It happens. I can't say that it was anything significant because Porter got up and still proceeded to be the dominant fighter in that fight. And then when Errol Spence dropped him, Porter got right up and still went after him. Remember, Errol Spence is the guy that almost concussed Chris Algieri with one shot. Errol Spence is the guy that completely destroyed Carlos Ocampo with his shots. Errol Spence is a tough fighter, and Errol Spence was landing flush. Danny Swift was landing flush, and Porter still kept coming. That level of doggedness and tenacity and willingness to basically leave it in the ring, because you're not just trying to win. That's obviously the big part of it, is to get your hand raised. But he's trying to entertain you. He realizes that you're paying money to see this guy in the ring, and you want to see the best of everybody in the ring, and ultimately, it's a two-way dance. If you got somebody that's constantly on the run, it's not going to be that exciting of a fight, so somebody's got to press the action, period, in a fight. Otherwise, you end up with a Rigondeaux situation, right? So he knows that This is his style, and he's going to fight the way he wants to fight, but he can mix it up when he needs to throw his opponent off. And he also knows that people underestimate how crafty he is, and he uses that to his advantage every time he goes in there. With this upcoming fight against Terence Crawford, and I'll tell you this, and then I'll wrap it up. I have been looking forward to this fight in particular more than any other for so long because I don't, in my opinion, this is my opinion, I don't see this pound for pound fighter of a Terence Crawford that everybody else seems to. Primarily because Terence Crawford, to date, at 147, has not fought a threat. The key for me to understand where a guy is how they perform against a threat. I'll go back to Hagler Hearns. In Hagler Hearns, Tommy Hearns drops Marvin Hagler early. He gets cut. I'm thinking, okay, this guy, Tommy Hearns, I was already a big fan. I've been a fan of his for ages. And I'm seeing Tommy Hearns literally just destroy guys. And if he's able to destroy somebody as durable as a marvelous Marvin Hagler, I can't do anything but respect that. However, what ends up happening? Marvin Hagler recovers. By the time that Marvin Hagler is able to switch everything around, Tommy Hearns basically gasses. He had thrown everything he had to work with. He was still fighting back, but he had less energy to go. And then Marvin Hagler finishes him. Those kinds of fights where you have, it appears on paper like, okay, my guy's going to blow this out. And then all of a sudden there's this upset where it shifts. Those kinds of fights are exciting. Those kinds of fights are compelling. We don't see those kinds of fights anymore. But in order to get those kinds of fights that actually get you off the edge of your seat, we have to have fighters who are willing to engage, period. When you looked at Fury versus Wilder 3 just recently, people criticized that fight as, quote, a couple of Neanderthals slugging it out. Yeah, because historically, the most exciting heavyweight fights have been fights, not boxing clinics. I'm talking exciting ones. Don't say Rumble in the Jungle because that was a clinch fest. It was not an exciting fight. The exciting guys were guys like George Foreman, guys like Joe Frazier, who would go in there basically slugging to get it done. That's not to say they weren't good boxers. That's to say that they're, in their mind, they're trying to get the other guy out of there. There's an aggression. There's an intent. There's an energy that cannot be understated. So when I look at a Fury Wilder 3, I see two guys ultimately who have the same goal, which is to get the other guy out of there. And at the end of it all, when the dust cleared, one guy stood tall, the other guy went down, but both of them deserved respect. This is what I see of Shawn, is no matter what fight it is, he earns my respect every single time because he's trying to entertain me as a fan. He has his styles, plural, and he uses them to his advantage against his opponent in a very creative, crafty way to where it doesn't even matter if it's at the time the number one guy in the division, Keith one-time Thurman. He actually goes razor close with Thurman. When Thurman is the top guy in the division, Danny Swift Garcia, who blew Amir Khan away, who's heralded at the time as a top 5, Porter makes it close with him. Errol Spence, who's considered the number one guy at welterweight, Shawn makes it Spence with him. Shawn makes it close every time he goes in there. I cannot not respect that. It is magical watching the guy in action. Is it pretty? No, but it's effective, to quote historical legends. My point is this. I have to date I've seen Shawn Porter perform against top level dangerous opposition. I have seen Shawn Porter leave it in the ring to get a win. I have seen Shawn Porter get up off the canvas off of really rough shots that I was scared for him. He gets up and he's still in there, and other shots where he just gets clipped. I have not seen Shawn Porter significantly hurt to the point where I ever was questioning whether he can continue or not. I've never seen Shawn Porter even get close to a towel thrown, taking a knee, none of it. He's a dog. He's got a dog in the game. People don't realize that Shawn Porter debuted at 154. So now I'm thinking in my head, that means that he was basically a little bit too small for 154, but 147 seems to be a perfect fit for him. But at the same time, it means, and you can see it, he's stocky, he's short, and he can come in low, and he can throw from awkward angles, which makes a very dangerous fight. When I look at his upcoming opponent in Terence Bud Crawford to me strikes me as a 140 pounder. This is what I see. Why? Because in every fight he had at 147, except for Jeff Horn, he was effectively outboxed by the opponent until the stoppage happened. In Jose Benavidez, that was a toss-up fight until Benavidez, his leg basically gave off with the shot, and that was the end of it, but that was by round 12. Up to that point, it was a toss-up. Jeff Horn, I'm not going to get into what I believe happened there. Regardless, Crawford won that clearly. Amir Khan. Khan is argued to be a glass chin, easy to knock out guy. Yet when Crawford lands on the chin, Khan gets up and goes right back to out jabbing Crawford in the head. So, okay, you can't take out Amir Khan. Mind you, this is a version of Amir Khan who was almost killed by Canelo, not 2 fights prior to that. And you can't get him off the chin. So then you toss a low blow. It was a blatant low blow. I don't care who says other. It was blatant. That's fine. But the point is, you couldn't get him off the chin. That's my problem. Then you fight Kavaliauskas. And with Kavaliauskas drops you. Everybody knows you got dropped. You keep saying it doesn't matter. But the point is, you got dropped. The point is, in Kavaliauskas, when I'm looking at this, I see at the time a guy who's unknown. He wasn't highly regarded. I understand he was a mandatory for WBO, but he wasn't highly regarded. And he caught you because you thought he wasn't going to get you. So my point is not to overrate Kavaliauskas. It is to call out that with a guy where you took him a little bit too lightly and you got clipped, it put you down and nobody knew who this guy was. And he hit you with a shot that Shawn Porter actually has perfected from my eyes. So now I'm saying, okay, this no longer is an obvious to call fight. I see Shawn could easily clip him with that same shot because the builds are similar between Kavaliauskas and Porter, and the shot Kavaliauskas threw was very similar in how it was thrown and where it came from. If Crawford takes a similar lightness, I don't think he will, but if he takes it lightly, just like he did there and gets caught with something, which brings me to Kell Brook. Kell Brook, the argument now across the web, and even Crawford himself, is, well, Kell Brook beat Shawn Porter, so we're going triangle theory. The version of Kell Brook that beat Shawn Porter for the IBF, number one, on domestic shores, number one, that was the peak. That was the pinnacle. That was prime Kell Brook. That's number one. Number two, Kell Brook was clinching for dear life not to have Shawn Porter wreck him. And that fight would have taken a whole different shape if he had not been clinching for dear life. We need to take that into consideration. But the version of Kell Brook that Crawford fought was, I believe, 2 fights removed from getting his eye shattered from Golovkin and his other eye shattered from Errol Spence. So I cannot lend credence to the quality or the health or the status or the level of Kell Brook that Crawford fought and say, because you beat this guy, it gives you confidence you should be able to beat Porter, because Porter would have destroyed the version of Kell Brook that Terence Crawford fought, because Kell Brook was damaged. He was heavily damaged. It was not even close. And Kell Brook still won every round against Crawford with nothing but a jab. This is what I see. When I look at the fight, I don't just look at the outcome. I look at the outcome, but I also have to take the whole fight into consideration. That's why when I look at Fury Wilder 1 as an example, and I see a situation where people just say, well, Wilder almost knocked out Tyson Fury. That's kind of the chatter. At the end of the day, Tyson Fury outboxed Deontay Wilder even in the rounds he was dropped. I cannot just look at the fact he got dropped and make it and call it. I've got to look at all of it. If you get outboxed the entire fight and then you catch somebody with something, I mean, it is what it is, but I can't do that. It's like Chavez Taylor. I'm not going to do that. I have to look at the totality of it all and say, in totality, no, the better man was X over here. This fight between Terence Bud Crawford and Showtime Shawn Porter is going to be an amazing fight for 2 main reasons. Number one, because I know Shawn Porter's going to show up. He's not washed. He's not damaged. He's not hurt. He even called out, behave like a fighter, which he always does every time he goes in that ring. He knows what this means, Shawn. Not just the belt, but also the recognition of beating the guy who's considered the pound for pound king at welterweight. This is amazing for me because I, again, look at the totality of the performances. From the totality of the performances, it's not close to me. It's not a wash or guarantee for Crawford for me because I have not seen against a dangerous opponent a level of opposition from Terence Crawford at 147. I am not considering 135. I'm not considering 140. I'm considering 147. And if I compare resume to resume, it's not close. Shawn Porter's resume is a who's who of the top of the division. And in every situation, he has shown up and performed and showed me he belongs in the upper echelon. Now he's going in there with Terence Bud Crawford. And for me, Crawford is the one who needs to prove to me what his level is by getting past arguably his most dangerous opponent possible. And do I believe he can? Sure. Anything can happen in the sport. I'm saying from my eyes today, I don't see this wash that everybody else seems to think is going to happen. I see that it's going to be a dogfight. I see that Shawn Porter is going to test this dude. I see that Shawn Porter has a very good chance of upsetting Terence Crawford. And I believe that if Shawn Porter can get this done, if he can get him out of there, there's no way you can't justify Shawn Porter's top three, even if you don't regard Crawford like I don't. The fact is, Shawn Porter will have been able to do what nobody else has done so far. And vice versa is true. If Terence Crawford is able to stop or knock out, I'm talking clean, not BS ref stuff. I'm talking clean, clear, it's obvious, the world sees it obvious, not sketchy in. If he's able to stop or drop or blow out decision Shawn Porter, he will have done what no other fighter has done, and thus it raises his credential. It validates what people say he is. That's all I've ever asked. I'm simply saying that because of what I have seen from Showtime Shawn Porter, from my perspective, I don't see it possible for Terence Crawford to get that knockout or stoppage or blowout. If Crawford does win, it's in a close fight. Likely that could go either way, just like with Spence. If somebody gets dropped, I personally think Shawn could get clipped with something, but I think it's more likely Crawford gets clipped with something like he did with Kavaliauskas. I believe that Shawn is going to be the constant aggressor, and by that I don't mean that he's going to go in there and constantly swing for the fences. I'm saying that comparing fight styles, I don't think Crawford's going to be the one constantly going forward. If Crawford gets a headbutt, unintentional headbutt because of styles, I think Crawford will get upset. He will make a mistake. He'll get clipped. This is going to be an exciting fight, but I want to give credit and kudos to Shawn Porter. He has my respect. He is the one guy, number one guy in my portfolio who is keeping boxing alive because he has done so much that he's part of the conversation of the top of the echelon of the division. And boxing should miss this guy when he does decide to hang it up because there's very few fighters who are like him, who actually enjoy going out there and entertaining fans. It's not even the skill or the style of the boxing, stance, none of this. I'm saying you want to entertain the fans. Even Crawford, I can't say, wants to entertain fans because we remember his fight against Paul Stahl where he basically just stared at him for rounds and clinched others. I'm talking where you're trying to entertain fans. You respect and love your fans. You don't let it get too much to your head, but you're confident about what you can do, and you go in there and you try to get it done each and every time. And even when you don't get your hand raised, you make a case for why you're up in the upper echelon. Kudos to you, sir. And this is going to be an exciting fight.